Welcome as we continue with this in this series. Um, a few introductory comments. Um, the rabbi that I want to talk about today, his name is Leo Beck, and it's important to know that his name was spelled Baeck, Leo Beck, and that I'll refer back to that in a little while. Um, he falls into the category of the rabbis. I never met the man, but one of his there are really two personal connections. One of his proteges,
Could you
um,
wait a minute longer?
oh, say something.
Now I was talking to the idiot who was wanting the parking space. He needed to
Okay,
get in
all right,
before we
okay,
got out. Yes.
all right. So one of Leo Beck's proteges was a rabbi educator by the name of Mayer Elk, ELK, who left Germany in the late 1930s. Beck stayed in Germany
Explain
during the
this.
Nazi period. We'll talk about that. But Mayer Elk was one of his prize students who left Germany and came to Palestine. He settled in Haifa and became the headmaster of a private school that was loosely aligned with the world progressive Jewish movement, the Reform, what's known in North America as the Reform movement, or liberal or progressive Judaism in the rest of the world. And Mayer Elk founded a school first as a secondary school, but then opened up an elementary school also in honor and named it in honor of his teacher Leo Beck. So it became known as one of the premier non-orthodox oriented, but religious. In other words, not it wasn't a secular oriented private school in Palestine later after 1948 in Israel. Uh, and my connection there is that's the high school that I attended as an exchange student through the Reform Movement's youth program back in the mid 1960s. So that was the first time that I had actually heard the name of Leo Beck. And Mayor Elk, who was the headmaster and was one of our teachers, taught us a lot about his teacher, about Leo Beck, and his heroism, the decisions that he made during the war, et cetera, that I'll be referring to as well. The second connection, personal connection, of why I consider Beck one of the rabbis, is that eventually, when I talk about his biography, eventually Leo Beck, after the war, moved to London and then came to the United States. When he was in London, he married for a second time, and his one of his daughters, Marianne, married then a up and coming Reform rabbi who also had been born in Great Britain but came to the States, wound up being a very well known scholar, congregational rabbi, and teacher at the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, a man by the name of Stanley Dreyfus. He was the longtime rabbi of Union Temple in Brooklyn. Stanley Dreyfus's daughter-in-law, uh, as well as three other members of her family, all became Reform rabbis. And Ellen, especially, they were all based in Chicago. And then Ellen Weinberg Dreyfus, Ellen Weinberg, who married Marianne Dreyfus's son James. Ellen Dreyfus became a colleague of mine, working in the youth programs, especially in the Reform Movement's youth camp, summer camp in Wisconsin, back in the 70s and 80s. And Ellen became not only she's extra famous for being the first woman, the first woman rabbi to be president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, but she was also the first woman rabbi in modern times to give birth as a rabbi. So the story is that when she was in the hospital after giving birth to her son, that the Orthodox rabbi came to visit, didn't know that she was a rabbi. The Orthodox rabbi got a list of all the Jewish patients in the hospital and went to visit, came in and said, Mrs. Dreyfus, hello, I'm Rabbi Solomon. Well, whatever. Mazel tov on your son's birth. Would you like me to be in touch with the moil? Would you like me to be in touch with the ritual circumciser? And she looked, according to the legend, she looks at him and says, "Well, hello, Rabbi Solomon. You're Rabbi Solomon the Moil. I'm Rabbi Dreyfus the mother." Kind of kind of thing. So there's one of those famous stories. So that's my personal connection and why I include Leo Beck in my list of rabbis. And hopefully I can do good justice in talking about him, his philosophy, his teaching, his heroism as well. The um, the reason that we specifically chose to include Leo Beck on our meeting today is because you may not be aware, but today is Yom HaShoah. Today is the Holocaust Memorial Day, as observed around the world. Indeed, in Israel this morning, the sirens went off, all traffic stops, the entire country goes silent for 2 minutes, and that's the pattern. But I wanted to make sure that we included Leo Beck in the list, and it coincidentally worked out to have the discussion on Yom HaShoah because his role, not only the heroism and the integrity that he displayed during the Shoah, during World War II, and during the Holocaust, but also the way that after the Holocaust, the way that he became an international spokesman for positive relationships between Jews and Christians, is something that is very, very important in his legacy as well. Okay, so with those comments in mind, I'll get a little more formal here. Um, Leo Beck was born in 1873. Um, and as I mentioned earlier, and he died in 1956. But as I mentioned earlier, his name is associated with many institutions of higher Jewish learning all around the world. Certainly in Germany, certainly in Great Britain, certainly in the United States, and in Israel. There's Leo Beck institutes here and there. The rabbinic school of the progressive movement in for Europe, one of the two. There's one in Germany and one in Great Britain. In London is called the Leo Beck College. I mentioned the Leo Beck School in Haifa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's perhaps best known as the famous and revered rabbi of Theresienstadt, one of the concentration camps, the model concentration camp in Czechoslovakia that was also known as Terezin. If you go visit Prague, there are day tours that go directly north. It's about a 2.5 hour drive directly north from Prague to the city of Terezin, and you can tour the model concentration camp of Theresienstadt as well. Beck maintained his humanity as well as the humanity of his congregants, his people, his followers, even in the face of horrible Nazi brutality. And he continued to teach no matter what the environment or atmosphere in which he found himself. He continued to teach um, that there should be a basis of ethics in our understanding of religious faith. And he continued to have an unwavering commitment to Judaism and a relationship to God. So he's born in Poland. His father was a local, small town, if you will, shtetl rabbi and scholar. Leo Beck was brought up in a traditional home. He observed all of the traditional dietary laws, studied Talmud on a regular basis. But also, what was unique was his father had a professional, very cordial relationship with the local Calvinist minister there near the border of Poland and Germany. And that sparked a long time, lifelong commitment on Leo Beck's part about the possibility of interfaith friendship and dialogue.
This is really sweet. Yeah.
In contrast to uh, his his maintaining a strong, devout faith in God, Leo Beck's approach to halacha, to Jewish law, did evolve and move towards the more progressive. When he left home initially from the original traditional halachic Talmudic studies that he went with his father. He went to Breslau and he enrolled first in the Jewish Theological Seminary there, which was the one of the forerunners of the conservative movement that as it began in Germany and then also came to North America. But in 1894, he frustratingly left the conservative yeshiva, the rabbinic school, and went to Berlin to study at what was then known as the most, um, not just famous, but the most um, forward looking school institution of Jewish higher education in the world, which was, pardon my German here, die Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, the Higher Institute for Jewish Studies, based in Berlin. They had both a secondary school as well as the rabbinic school, the yeshiva, and he was granted his rabbinic smicha, his ordination as a rabbi, in 1897. He also pursued a PhD in philosophy, which he earned through the University of Berlin. He served as a rabbi in a few small towns, and then in Dusseldorf, and then as of 1912 was called to be one of the rabbis, and then eventually the rabbi, the head rabbi of the Jewish community of Berlin. During World War I, he served as a military chaplain. He served at the front, eastern and western fronts, and not only worked with the troops, but also reached out to many of the citizens and in the small Jewish towns that surrounded Germany and Poland and Russia as well. He grew up and studied again as a college student and a graduate student. He associated with the rationalist type of Jewish thinking, whose most famous adherent and teacher was Hermann Cohen, a 19th century philosopher, who characterized Judaism with the following quote: that Judaism is a religion of reason. Hermann Cohen saw human reason as the foundation of universal ethics, and therefore as a goal of religion as the realization of morality in the life of the individual. So it was much more of a rationalist kind of thinking rather than a religion that was based on strictly on faith, because this comes at a time when a more relatively known statement was that you made a choice between knowledge and belief, if you will, between that was which was empirical, or that which you could rationally explain, if not scientifically explain, and that which involved only a leap of faith. We don't understand it. We can't prove it. We can't disprove it, but we can choose to believe it. We can choose to have faith in it. And Hermann Cohen was following Immanuel Kant and others, conceived of God as not only as the source of all of the practices and observances and morals and ethics, but that the realization was that the idea of God was created by human beings to add a sense of legitimacy, and I don't want to say logic, but of proper thinking to the ethical systems that had been handed down by all the religious communities through the generations. Um, Along came another name that we've mentioned once or twice, Franz Rosenzweig, who told the story that Hermann Cohen once was giving a lecture about the notion that God was created, or at least the concept of God was created by human beings to fulfill the need and the rationale for why to have ethics and why to have laws in society, et cetera, et cetera. So Hermann Cohen was giving this lecture, explains in a small town the ideas about God which he had developed, and a little old man approaches him afterwards, and when Hermann Cohen had finished, walks up to him and he says, "Yes, but where's Borei Ha'olam? Where's the God who created the world? Where I can understand what you're saying logically, but why are we here? How are we here? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And it's a question that would have resonated with Beck. Not that he would have had an answer necessarily, but he would have resonated and affirmed the need of this old Jew to question all the rational explanations that were going around. Beck was concerned less with philosophical certainty and the idea of God than with what his congregants, his people, the Jews who listened to him, who studied with him, etc. He was much more concerned with their actual spiritual needs. And if they wanted to drift towards the spiritual, if you will, and they wanted to drift towards the traditional notions of God as the creator rather than of man creating God, that was perfectly fine with Beck. He wanted to preserve morality as the basic foundation of Judaism, no matter how each individual might get there. Was it possible to develop a theology that allowed for a living relationship with God and yet maintained that ethics and having a positive relationship, like Buber would say, one to the other, I and thou, if you do, that this is the question that not only drove Leo Beck's theological teaching, but also he felt that's what drove and was the stimulus for every Jew's personal identity. So Leo Beck, his best known work is called "The Essence of Judaism." Was written following the publication of a Protestant theologian's book called "The Essence of Christianity." That book compared Judaism unfavorably with Christianity, and in response, Beck wrote his book as the leader of the German Jewish community, describing Christianity not in negative terms, but as a romantic, he used the word feminine type of tradition based on feelings and based on a search for grace. Whether as Judaism, his word again, was more of a masculine type of orientation towards action rather than just thought and belief. Christianity, he said, essentially has a non-ethical character, and it could not be, again, I'm using Beck's terms, Christianity could not be reformed by trying to add on to it or graft onto it ethical principles. Christianity was based on belief and strictly on belief, whereas the fundamentally moral basis of Judaism is the attempt to continue to make Jewish values and Jewish practices compatible with the ethical realities of the modern world. Jewish ethics, he taught, had to be founded on religious certainty, that there was a living God who dictates basic moral norms as part of God's relationship with us. But there's this a tension between each individual's personal relationship with God as well as God being the supreme ruler, and to understand God is more transcendent, if you will. The bottom line of this discussion is that Leo Beck's teaching of ethical monotheism had two important implications. First is that we human beings, and we as Jews, have the responsibility to choose between good and evil, however we see it. That's the ultimate center of our Jewish lives. Um, the center, the traditional idea of knowing right from wrong, good from evil, and knowing that there is the process of teshuvah, of return, of repentance, and of changing behavior. Secondly, Beck also teaches his idea that ethics, and rather than ceremony and observance and kashrut and all of that, that ethics is at the core of Judaism. He distinguished between law, which he considered to be human, and mitzvot, commandments, which which lead towards morality, even if we don't necessarily see the connection. The rituals which we as humans devise to understand God more completely or more clearly create a framework for the realization of that which is ethical, and that again, which is the most important, because your particular understanding of the mitzvah, your particular understanding of the commandment, your particular understanding of how to observe any of the commandments or any of the holidays or whatever it might be, or like we've talked about in other opportunities, the different responsa, the different way to realign and find meaning in a particular question and answer. Um, that's that's what's most important for Beck, as each individual tries to maintain the relationship with the transcendent God. So this quote, this is a universal meaning which Beck gave to the concept of chosenness, the chosen people, and this is one of his central themes. Only the Jews chose to make morality guide defined by our search for God, our connection to God, if you will, ethical monotheism, which is the basis of our national ethnic identity. So that's where that's kind of an overall introduction, if I was able to do it in some clarity of Leo Beck's teaching. Let's go back and talk especially about his role in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, and what that meant, because that's the stuff of legend, and heroism, and fate, and luck, fortune, if you will. Um, so I'm going to work on two things. One is based on the an excellent biography that just came out a little more than a year ago, authored by one of my professors, also who is a personal friend, Professor Michael Meyer, now Professor Emeritus of Modern Jewish History from the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And Meyer just published a very well annotated biography of Leo Beck. Just came out last year. So I'm kind of paraphrasing some of the things from Michael Meyer's introduction. By August 1939, the German Jews situation had become desperate. Since Hitler's rise to power in 33, 6 years earlier, um, um, the gains that Jews had made in being accepted and finding equality in Germany were being eroded bit by bit. In 1933, with the Nuremberg laws, Jews were removed from all positions of power and influence in German society. They were reduced from the status of citizens to mere subjects of the state. Simultaneously, the Nazis, by taking over their property, imposed impoverishment on the Jews. In 36, I'm sorry, in 38, we encountered in November 38, we encountered Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, November 9th, 10th of 1938. Hundreds of synagogues were destroyed, property destroyed. Jews were now singled out by name. Men were forced to take the name, change all their documents' name into Israel. Women had to change their names to Sarah. Um, Most German Jews tried to ride it out, if you will. Some of them were descendants of many generations who had lived in Germany, and they chose to stay because this is where they were comfortable. They assumed that this whole the whole difficult time would blow over. But by 38, 39, more of them were starting to look for avenues of escape. Um, and then we encounter all kinds of countries around the world that could have accepted persecuted Jews, but they wound up severely limiting their immigration. This all sounds familiar, doesn't it? Among those fortunate to find a refuge outside Germany were many of the communal leaders and rabbis who understandably chose to save their own lives and those of their families. Many came of their own volition. Many were brought out by secret actions of Jewish communities from around the world, and schools and institutions and rabbinic schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, including some names that you might be familiar with. For example, Gunther Plaut. So those who study in the Torah study group on Saturday morning know about the Plaut commentary. Well, Plaut was one of the German students who, as a young boy, was brought out by the North American Reform Jewish community. They literally purchased their freedom of 7 or 8 young students and brought them to the United States, where they were literally adopted by families or communities, and they never saw their families again. In Plaut's case, his brother also was able to survive the war and came out. But in 1939, Leo Beck was very involved in helping others emigrate, both publicly and secretly. Multiple efforts to facilitate immigration, especially for young people. In August, just before the outbreak of the war, which of course was September 1st, 1939, in August, he actually went to visit relatives who had settled in England. They tried to convince him to stay in England, to join. He had a daughter there and her family. A British university offered him an academic position. The community of German immigrants wanted him to stay and assume leadership of the community there, but Leo Beck refused. He said that his place was back in Berlin. He even used the phrase saying that he should be the last Jew to leave Germany, and that despite all the dangers there, he would return, he would remain, and do what he could to expedite immigration as long as Jews were still permitted to leave Germany, and until the rise of the camps and the horror that we know and we commemorate today on Yom HaShoah. His principal task shifted to, once he could no longer provide avenues of immigration, shifted to upholding morale and alleviating suffering and being compassionate to those who had no longer any choice but to remain. Assisted those, provided secret hiding for many. And then in January of 1943, he was deported to Theresienstadt, which, as I said before, in Czechoslovakia was the model concentration camp. It was the camp where the International Red Cross, the Nazis would take representatives of the International Red Cross or the League of Nations or other people who were concerned about the stories they were hearing about the way Jews were being treated, and they would take them to Theresienstadt, where there were schools. Leo Beck was teaching; he was lecturing all the time. There were schools that, excuse me, almost looked like a summer camp, and there were children's drawings and pictures that were placed up on the walls, and there was decent food in the cafeterias, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Beck was the rabbi there. He continued to serve the emotional, spiritual, intellectual needs of his fellow Jews, along with some non-Jews who were sent there as well, all of them confined in Theresienstadt. Now, push the pause button. This is as good a time as any to tell a coincidental but literally life-saving story. Even though Theresienstadt was not a death camp, the Nazis still, on a regular basis, maybe not daily, but maybe weekly, still had roll calls, and still all the Jews and all the prisoners had to come out and stand in line for hours and hours and hours and be counted and then recounted, and their names all checked off of the lists and whatever. And according to the story, this is some eyewitnesses. Beck himself never talked about it, to the best of my knowledge. But according to other eyewitnesses, there was a new commandant of the camp of Theresienstadt, who didn't know any of the history of the people who were there, and certainly not of the rabbis or the leaders of the community. And when he came into position, he wanted to, whether he was critical of the previous commandant or not, but he wanted to enforce a little more strict posture amongst his troops and the prisoners. So at his first roll call, he arbitrarily took a list of all the prisoners and started calling out names No one knew exactly why, but many of the prisoners, again, according to the story, many of the Jewish prisoners assumed that they were being called out for deportation, or even worse, perhaps for immediate punishment or some kind of even death. And to everyone's horror, one of the first names, because it was alphabetical, one of the first names that was read by this new commandant was Leo Beck. And there's a kind of a gasp on the part of all the prisoners, all the Jews who are lined up. And Rabbi Leo Beck started to take a step forward until another man kind of reached out with his left hand and kind of pushed him back and whispered, "No, stay." And this man stepped forward when the commandant came down the row and said, "What is your name?" He said, "Leo Beck," which was indeed his name, but it was spelled Beck, as opposed to Rabbi Leo Beck, who spelled his name Baeck. And the Leo Beck who stepped forward was indeed taken away, deported, and was lost in one of the concentration camps. Now, it's just one of those stories of which there are hundreds, if not thousands, of either we don't know whether it was a mistaken identity, whether whether the intention was for Rabbi Leo Beck to be taken, whether the intention was for this other man who spelled his name differently to be taken. But in the end result, it was Rabbi Leo Beck who survived, and not only survived, but was able to become one of the most important figures in all of Jewish history of the 20th century. So it's one of those crazy, crazy, crazy stories. Um, uh, Beck continued to teach in the concentration camp. He was one of the most important thinkers, as I said, of the 20th century. Uh, Many people are more familiar with names like Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig and Abraham Joshua Heschel. But Beck certainly, as a leader of his community in dark times, um, is even better known, and certainly in Europe. And more recently, people have come to study, as did Michael Meyer, have come to study his particular teaching and his understanding and the way that he was trying to put human ethics in Jewish terms, as well as to relate between Judaism and Christianity. Um, uh, Beck's faith in God, this is a quote from Michael Meyer. Beck's faith in God implied the acceptance of moral obligation in all areas of life. Fulfilling that obligation was, in his eyes, no less a requirement in difficult times than it was in calmer ones, even if the cost should be far greater. So that's Michael Meyer's story, the way that he interprets it. I go back to some other comments, and in the biography, the way that it was handed down by another one of Leo Beck's students. Some of you may, if anybody has Chicago connections, you might know the name of Herman Schallmann, who also was one, like Gunther Plaut, was one of the 7 or 8 young Jewish students who were brought to the United States. Brilliant, brilliant young students and brilliant, very successful rabbis in the Reform movement. Herman Schallmann served Congregation Emmanuel in Chicago for something like 60 years. So Schallmann tells the stories that he remembers about from family members, etc., that Beck was deported, as we said, to Theresienstadt in 1943. And his job as a prisoner was actually to perform physical labor working on garbage trucks. Um, while he was there, three of his sisters died in the camp. Again, it was more from diphtheria or typhus, rather. It was not a death camp. And one other sister also died once Beck had arrived. He was he was appointed honorary president of the Jewish Council there in the camp. And again, for with that kind of image, I would refer you like to the scenes in Schindler's List, where people had to stand in long line for hours and hours and hours to ask for permission to to take something out of the ghetto, or if they had a complaint against the Nazis or whatever it might be. But he was honorary president of that council, and his spiritual job was to try to maintain humanity as much as possible. He took every opportunity to continue his work as a rabbi and a scholar. He taught philosophy classes as he walked through the camp, even collecting garbage. In the evenings, hundreds of people would crowd into one of the barracks to hear him lecture, and he did so because he didn't have the books in front of him, so he would lecture only from memory. Um, and then one of the difficult questions that was always asked to him when when the actual word of the Shoah, of the fate, the destruction of millions of Jews came to be known in Theresienstadt and in the Jewish community, he made a decision at the time. He was informed of this by virtue of his position as a leader, but he made the personal decision not to share the knowledge with with the other prisoners, the other residents. Well, residents is not a good word. The other prisoners who were living in Theresienstadt. And he wrote the following: living in the expectation of death by gassing would be all the much harder. This death was not certain for all, so I came to the grave decision to tell no one. He was criticized after the war for keeping silent about it. May 1945, when Theresienstadt was liberated, um, Beck, like in a similar story that Elie Wiesel tells as well, Beck stood up and prevented the inmates from going and trying to kill the guards that were handed over to them by the Russians. And then he stayed on. Again, the Russians and then the Allies all tried to move him out and bring him to safety in England or whatever, but he insisted on staying in Czechoslovakia and in Germany to minister to those who were sick and dying. And then eventually they finally convinced him to move on to London. He became the honorary chairman of the World Union of Progressive Judaism. And then from London, once there were children and grandchildren being born in the United States, then he came to the United States, taught at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati as well. Let me see. I think that there it is. Okay, so he survived the war with his worldview intact. He interpreted the Holocaust as a failure of human morality, which only served to underline his ethical commitment and his faith that the way to humanity does not lead away from Judaism, it leads through our Judaism. And then when he wrote a prayer which he asked in the German community to be recited. Initially, it was to be recited on Yom Kippur, on Kol Nidre night, and then eventually it was accepted by the liberal Jewish community of Europe. And in their prayer book, this is included as a prayer that or a statement that should be read on Yom HaShoah, and so that's why I wanted to include it today as well. So Leo Beck says, "Our history is the history of the grandeur of the human soul and the dignity of human life. In this day of sorrow and pain, surrounded by infamy and shame, we still turn our eyes to the days of old, from generation to generation, to our God who redeemed our fathers. God will redeem us in the days to come. We bow our heads before God and remain upright and erect before man. We know our way and we see the road to our ultimate goal." So there's my story of Leo Beck. And again, an amazing teacher, courageous man. Not all of the Jewish community of his time agreed with him for philosophical reasons, for political reasons, strategic reasons, but he has quite a legacy, and I thought it important to share it, especially on today on Yom HaShoah. I'll sit back. As anyone went a little bit early today, but again, as some of you know, I'm dealing with a number of other issues and tragedies and trying to help some other families through some situations. So I may take the extra couple of minutes. Yes, please, Gail.
Yes, this book that Michael Myers wrote
Yes.
about Leo Beck, is this one you would recommend for a layperson, or is there another about Leo Beck that you would say would be better?
Myers' book is not really written for the layperson.
Oh, okay.
That doesn't mean that you wouldn't benefit from it. It will break your checking account, however. So if you can find a library that has a copy of
Okay.
it, I think it's like $60 or $70 or something like
Yikes.
that. It's a very, it's a large volume. But Meyer is
Okay.
an excellent historian.
Is there another book about Beck that you would recommend?
Not that I can think of offhand. I'll have to look through a bibliography
Oh, okay.
and see. I was looking more for some articles and some things that I had in a file
Hmm.
that I've collected through the
Okay.
years. I'm sure there are some other there. I don't remember the name of the. I don't remember the author, but there's something like Leo Beck, teacher of Theresienstadt, or something like that. Um, but I'll try to do some looking and see if I can
Okay.
share something with you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. Anything else that I can help anybody with? I know that if Michael G was on, he would want to ask some questions about the Holocaust, but about the show up. But okay. Well, if not, then I appreciate everyone's tuning in. The plan is to meet again next month, the fourth Thursday, and we will be at that time. Thanks for the heart there, Gracie. Okay. At that time, we're going to talk about Rabbi Sally Priesand,
Hmm.
who, of course, is recognized as the first woman rabbi of the modern era, the modern generation. She's also originally from Cleveland, um, uh, and which makes her all the more qualified to be a leader of our people. But seriously, Sally is a very humble person, very capable person, and when we meet, it will be something like 10 days shy of the actual 50th anniversary of her ordination at the Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati. I remember being there. I remember the moment, and I'll share some other memories when we do meet again about it a month from now. But I remember that when it came, because the in her class of which many of her classmates are colleagues and friends of mine, but when they got to her name in the alphabetical order, No one had to say anything, but the entire congregation rose just as one, silently, and just rose, stood, acknowledging the moment. Of course, I had another memory of that day. It was also the first time that I had heard six 12-string guitars all playing at the same time in these hallowed halls of a sanctuary in Cincinnati that was built in 1867, and just the sound of those 12-string guitars. That's another memory, and that reverberation in my mind that I'll never forget. But I look forward to sharing some of Sally's writings and some of the things that people. It was not without controversy for her to be ordained at that time. Yes, Jean.
When did Leo Beck die, or correction, how old was Leo Beck when he died, and what did he die of?
As far as I know, he died of old age. I don't think that he was sick. He died in 1956. So he was 80 something, approximately. He was a very, very slight man. That much I know. But I don't
Well,
remember
it's
hearing anything about
wonderful
about
that
about illness or incapacitation at the end of his days.
it's
He was still
amazing.
vital.
You get through the whole Holocaust and all of that entailed, and then live a long life and die in the 80s. That's wonderful.
Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And continue to teach and lead and inspire. Absolutely. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I won't be able to see most of you on Saturday morning because I'll be in an airplane flying back to Michigan for a funeral. But I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you again soon.